All right, I'm not sure if there's a lag. I think we're live.
Yeah, I see the live sign.
Okay, good. Good. All right, guys. Well, thanks for being here if you're here. I'm super excited to have my next guest for the next episode. Uh-oh. I have some feedback going on here. I apologize for that. Sorry, guys. Apologize for the rough start. But my next guest, he's a doctor. He's got his PhD in evolutionary genetics as his expertise. His website is ZacharyArdern.com. You can follow him on Twitter at Zachary_Ardern. Dr. Zachary Ardern, thank you so much for being here, sir.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, so the first question I usually ask is about your sorry, I can't speak. your background, how you came to faith, what made you get interested in apologetics, what made you get interested in even just evolutionary genetics and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I was raised in a Christian family, and I guess interacting with people who weren't Christians and a fairly secular context at school and university, I obviously had a bunch of questions. I was really interested in science, decided to study biology, and my first year of university had some very atheistic professors who tied their evolution, what that they were teaching, to their atheism. So that kind of made me think about that a bit more. I'd read various books for and against evolution, and that forced me to make up my own mind about what I think about these things, basically. Yeah.
Right on. So you don't see evolution because typically that's kind of the dichotomy we get is, well, if you believe in God, you're going to believe in special creation, maybe even literally 6 days, all that kind of stuff, and then evolution, that's strictly for the atheist, but you take a different position.
Yeah, I think that evolution is not necessarily atheistic. So the more I looked into it from the perspective of my faith and the biblical text, and also from the science and the history of science, and especially the philosophy of science, the more I realized that there's a lot more kind of gray middle ground area than the way that it's often set up as the sharp dichotomy would suggest. So I think there's a lot of fruitful middle ground that we can explore.
Right on. Yeah. So real quick before we get to that, I did want to ask what your current research is focused on.
Yeah. So my PhD was in experimental evolution in yeast, and analyzing some populations that had been evolved to see what changes had occurred, and some of the theory behind that. My current work is comparing different bacterial genomes and trying to understand the origin of new genes in bacterial genomes, particularly a special kind of gene, which is called an overlapping gene. And if people are interested in that, they can look me up online and find some things that we've written about that.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely recommend anybody watching do that. So the question is inevitable when we're talking about theistic evolution, which is, well, kind of as I mentioned before, is that you kind of got this dichotomy, right? As it's seen as evolution is anti-Bible, it's anti-Genesis. So what would you say are like the most important issues in the kind of the creation versus evolution debate?
Yeah, so there's a few points I guess I'd want to make with anyone who kind of first comes across this issue or sees it as a major stumbling block. The first is that the scientific question is a question of method, and I think that's not going to be the key issue when you're considering whether Christian faith is true or not. So questions of how something might have happened are a different kind of question than does God exist? Did Jesus rise from the dead? So the core questions of the Christian faith, I think, aren't really touched by the method, whatever method that was, whatever the details were behind the process of creation. And secondly, I want to say that there's actually, like I kind of hinted before, there's a wide spectrum on these issues. It's not just a simple dichotomy between strict young earth creationism and atheistic evolutionism. There's a lot of middle ground. I think once you start to see that there's actually a spectrum, quite a smooth spectrum with a lot of different intermediate positions, then that gives people room to kind of relax a bit and think, okay, well, where on the spectrum exactly do I lie? And and just realize that there isn't just a sharp choice, that everyone has a slightly different position on that spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's really important because, there's different interpretations a lot of places in the Bible. And my thing is, I don't think Christians should be necessarily fighting over these things. I think it's something we can kind of come together and discuss. But then at the end of the day, we can team up and go after the ideas we really think are bad. So I do think a lot of maybe Christians who kind of reject evolution outright because they think they kind of have to, aren't always necessarily willing to listen to what the evidence is, maybe from an atheist, because they kind of assume, well, you're already coming at it from an anti-Bible perspective, so why would we take you seriously? But so you, as a Christian, I am interested to know what particular evidence you would find persuasive in favor of the theory of evolution.
Yeah, so overall, I guess I'd emphasize that it is a cumulative case, that there's kind of multiple lines of evidence, and that in the same way as I guess a lot of recent apologetics and historical apologetics really emphasizes the cumulative case is where the strength lies in the case for Christianity. In the same way, that's where the strength lies in the case for evolution. For me personally, my biased view, because I'm a geneticist, is I'm particularly impressed by the genetic evidence because I'm working with that regularly, and I can see the intricacies there. And the genetic evidence basically is that we see patterns of genetic similarity between organisms which match prior expectations based on both the fossil record and morphology, the kind of basic body plans of organisms. All of these three things together basically point in the same direction. And I think that pattern taken together is very strong, particularly taken with the temporal pattern through the fossil record. I think that's very hard to explain other than some kind of progressive developmental process, and evolution is basically a synonym for a progressive developmental process.
Mm-hmm. So maybe if you don't mind, if I could maybe softball a couple of the common objections
Sure.
that I've heard from creationists. So maybe the first one is the distinction between micro and macro evolution. Mm-hmm. Most Christians are willing to admit, they'll say, yeah, we see microevolution, we see changes within species. Nevertheless, we don't think that it's justifiable to go to the next step, which is macroevolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And part of the difficulty is that how micro and macro get defined are different among different people and have changed over time. So for instance, you said that we don't see changes between species, but now even the strictest young earth creationists will accept that we do see changes between species, and they'll push the level of the biblical kind up quite a bit further. A few years ago, they would push it to the point of genus, but there's a lot of material online discussing recently how actually now it's been pushed back to the level of family, or maybe even the level of order, which is a huge biological step that's been made. So, and this has really been forced in particular by the genetics, that we see the genetic similarity between some of these organisms is reasonably high, and we see that a number of these organisms can interbreed. And just the pattern is so striking that matches the expectations of common descent. It's very hard to deny descent below, say, the level of order. But then the question is, well, where do you stop? And it seems to me that pattern continues upwards right the way through the tree of life. So for me, there's no clear cutting off point where it would be reasonable to say, okay, this is where evolution starts and this is where evolution stops. There are some differences that could be debated in terms of micro and macro evolution, but these would be at the level of probably the body plan of the organism and the developmental programs of different organisms. And I'm really not an expert on that because I study bacteria. I don't study animal genetics at all. So I haven't really studied that much about the evolutionary developmental side of things. But that's where some mainstream evolutionary biologists would put a distinction between micro and macro in terms of the larger scale body plans of organisms. But I think even there that we still see the same pattern that fits the broad expectations of some kind of tree of life.
Okay, yeah, because I've often heard evolutionists, they'll say, well, there actually isn't a distinction. I've heard them say that macro is micro, just over a longer time scale. So yeah, would you disagree with that or no?
That's just a current or a long running debate in the literature, and people will take there's mainstream evolutionary biologists who will take both sides of that, and I think that my interpretation is the way that could be split is in terms of the some of the developmental genes, basically. And some organisms will fit into different categories based on different developmental genes, but there's still, when you take the big picture, there's still seem to be a relatively smooth gradation between the different kinds of organisms. So it's hard to find a cutoff point where evolution could conceivably stop, given the evidence that we have.
Okay. Now, do you think it's a fair point when creationists will bring up, let's say, well, yeah, we'll give you that, there's a common genetic code, but this could just as easily be evidence of a common design or not necessarily a common ancestor?
I guess there's a few things in there. So it depends what we mean by common genetic code. The convincing evidence for common descent is not just that there is a single standard genetic code, which is with only minor variations is found across organisms, but the particular kinds of differences and similarities that we see across organisms. So one famous example is pseudogenes, that there are numerous genes that appear to be broken, and the evidence of shared mistakes. So a nice analogy is with plagiarism. So if a student is copying another student and makes the same spelling mistakes, looking at those tests or those exams, it's much easier to infer some kind of copying process when the mistakes are also shared. And rather than a kind of a common design, like just independently coming to the same answer, you wouldn't expect to see the same mistakes as well. So there's an analogy there with pseudogenes, with broken genes. And there's a whole class of different genetic elements that are kind of related to that tie in with this argument of shared mistakes. So that's one aspect of it. But in general, it's just the very detailed patterns of similarity that match the broad expectations from the other sources of knowledge that we have, the fossil record and the morphology.
Okay, that makes sense. So you said you've done some work with bacteria and studied bacterial evolution.
Yeah.
So if I were playing the young Earth creationist here, I'd be like, yeah, Zachary, but they always stay bacteria. They don't change into anything else, like a whale or a flower or any of that kind of stuff.
Sure. So bacteria are actually remarkably diverse, which makes sense when we understand that they've been around for the last 3 or 4 billion years or whatever it is exactly. So they've had a lot of time to diversify. So the differences between the different classes of bacteria are quite strong. So there's not just obviously just one species of bacteria. So what we do see in small scale experimental evolutions, we do see changes. We see the same kinds of changes that we see when you're comparing genomes of different modern species to each other. So it looks like the same kinds of processes that happen in the lab could conceivably explain what we see between the organisms that we see around us. So things like pseudogenes, the breaking of genes, we see that happen in the lab. Gene duplications, genes being copied, we see that happening in the lab. Single nucleotide changes, it's insertions, deletions, chromosomal rearrangements, we see all these things happening in the lab. When you add these up, you extrapolate, you can see how you could get an evolutionary process that would explain all the diversity that we see around us.
Right on. Yeah. So okay. So we look at the evidence. We conclude, okay, evolution is a thing that takes place. Now, do you think that the atheist is justified in kind of making the leap? Okay, well, there you go. Look, turns out we don't need God to explain life at all.
So it depends what we mean by God explaining something. I think which is quite a difficult question, but it's quite clear to me that we do need God to explain various things about the universe, and life only exists because the universe exists. So the fact the universe exists at all, the fact it's ordered, the fact that it's fine-tuned, and has various other properties. I think each of these points is best explained by God existing. So if we completely forget the specific biological evidence, we have a bunch of reasons to think that God exists. And in conjunction with the biology, then we would, I think, be reasonable to infer that God has some involvement in the biology, even if the biology itself was completely neutral in what it said about God. So if we have independent reasons to think God exists, then we have reason to think that God was involved in the evolutionary process, even if we can't see evidence of that in the process itself. Now, I think that we can see some evidence of God's involvement in the process itself, but that's much more controversial. And that's something that I'm still kind of thinking through and developing. But there's a lot of people who are quite mainstream in evolutionary biology who have said that in the past, or who do say that today. So one of them was the co-founder of the theory of evolution, Wallace. And he was a believer in kind of a progressive form of evolution, where there was some kind of guidance of the process. And that's just one example. A modern example is Simon Cornell Morris, who until very recently was a professor at Cambridge, and certainly one of the leaders in paleontology. So yeah, there's a lot of people and ideas that I could talk about there, but both from reasons outside biology and I think some reasons inside biology, it's fully reasonable to think that God was involved in the evolutionary process.
Okay, and so do you think that would look more like God kind of setting it up and kind of designing it from the outset and then just letting natural processes take over? Or do you think that God would be involved in the process as it goes?
I think that dichotomy is not quite as sharp as it might seem, because God is constantly upholding and sustaining the universe. So the way I see laws of nature is that they are God's, in some sense, like the early modern scientists like Isaac Newton thought, they are God's commands to the universe. He is the king of everything, and he's commanding, he's making laws, he's giving prescriptive commands that are commanding the universe what to do. And that's something in that region is what laws of nature are. So the idea that he just kind of sits back and watches things happen, I think that's just not how God actually interacts with the universe at all, let alone in biology. So given that, then it's harder for me to see kind of a sharp distinction between God being involved in the evolutionary process and God just letting it happen. Because if he's sustaining every second of it, then everything that happens is by God's quite active permission, at least. So I think I'm agnostic about the methods involved, really, like, or even what that means to talk about intervention or guidance in that process. I think there's a range of possibilities, and all that I think we can see is that there's some hints of purpose, there's some hints of fine-tuning, there's some hints of teleology, these kinds of things. And exactly how that was achieved, maybe we'll never be able to find out. Maybe we can, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it makes sense. Kind of like how you were saying earlier about the cumulative case. So like, even if we don't think that God necessarily interjects and puts DNA information here and then here and then here,
yeah,
nevertheless, he's still upholding the natural laws which allow mutation and natural selection to take place.
Well, just a quick comment. Also, the results we see in biology are amazing. And something like the human brain is, I think it's reasonable to say that's miraculous in some sense. And it doesn't, a miracle doesn't have to be going against laws of nature or breaking laws of nature or anything like that. So I think we can look at that and be amazed at that and think surely God was involved in creating that. And exactly how that was achieved, whether it was purely through processes that we would call natural, I think that's something that we can try and investigate. And for Christians, it doesn't really matter how it works out, because God is sustaining every second of the universe. So any creative process that happens, God is somehow involved in that.
Cool. So one thing that just occurred to me, I wanted to ask you, and I don't necessarily even want to ask you to speak on behalf of like all evolutionists.
Sure. Yeah.
But I did want to ask you about the problem of the first life, because it's often claimed that that there really isn't an explanation for this, and then sometimes, well, there is an explanation, but sometimes they don't always line up with each other. So how would you respond to the problem of getting that first life?
I mean, I don't have an answer. I think that's definitely one of the biggest mysteries in historical science, and it might just be that we're too far distant from those processes. The Earth is too different now to what it was then. But certainly that's something that I see as a pointer towards just the existence of life, as I think a pointer towards some kind of mind behind the process, both through the fine-tuning and through some of the details that we see in life, like the complexity of cellular life and molecular machines and the human brain and all these things in some way point towards God. But I don't think, I don't want to claim that that's proof of intervention. I don't think we need to claim that. in order to see it as some kind of evidence for design or guidance or purpose.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I do think, and maybe you could speak to this a little bit, because it's often claimed that when doing forensic science, how you talk about we're so far removed from the event, whatever happened that allowed the first life to come out. We're so far removed from that, we can only really use forensic science to get at that. And I do think it's reasonable to look at how cause and effect work now and ask, is it reasonable to assume it worked the same in the past? So, for example, now we know that specified information and messages only come from minds. And so I do think it's reasonable to look in the past and think that may have happened in the first life. Because, it's often claimed by the evolutionists, will say, well, how can you get such a complex code from just matter? And they'll say, well, it didn't start off this complex. It was much simpler in the past. But then even when we look at into just single-celled amoebas, the amount of information there is it's amazing how much there is.
Well, I mean, there's a huge amount there, but to some extent, I think it's plausible that we do see how complexity could increase over time. So I think sometimes often this is overstated by apologists, and it's kind of a lack of imagination on their part, and also maybe a lack of understanding of some of the progress that has been made in the origin of life field. So I wouldn't want to overstate the case, but I think there is, and also I wouldn't want to say that specified complexity. So maybe specified complexity is evidence of a mind, but I think we can't make the jump to what processes were involved behind that. So one way that mind could have introduced that specified complexity was right at the Big Bang, for instance. And so I think too often proponents of intelligent design or creationism or such, they jump to a conclusion of interventionism, which I think isn't really justified by the evidence. So at most, if the argument worked, it would be evidence, okay, there's some mind behind the process, which I'm completely happy with. But I don't want to make the jump to specific claims of intervention at particular time points or such. At least I haven't seen a good case for that. So with the origin of life, I'm kind of just agnostic, and I think in some way that presents some kind of evidence for some kind of mind behind the process, but that's open to further scientific investigation, basically.
Okay, fair enough. So you talked a little bit before about the fine-tuning. It's not just necessarily an argument for it in biology, but from the Big Bang and throughout chemistry and physics. Do you think you could speak a little bit more to that?
Sure. I mean, I'm not a cosmologist or a physicist, so I probably wouldn't get those details correct. But there's a number of fundamental constants and initial conditions which were involved, which are kind of core to modern cosmological theory. And it turns out if we change these slightly, then life would simply not be possible. Chemicals interacting in interesting ways would not be possible, let alone life as we know it. So that's the case for physics, but it goes the next level. It goes into chemistry as well. So there's some excellent work by Michael Denton in a book called Nature's Destiny, and some follow-up articles and books that he has that spell out some of these details in chemistry and how chemistry seems set up in such a way that that life is possible, and that if things were slightly changed at the chemical level as well, then life as we know it would not be possible. So the general idea is called the fitness of the environment for life. So evolutionists tend to think that organisms will adapt to any environment, but understanding the concept of the fitness of the environment helps you to realize that you actually need the right environment first before you can have life at all, and particularly before you can have complex life like we find. So Michael Denton has gone into this in a lot of detail. One example that I like is the possibility for photosynthesis depends on a particular narrow wavelength of light actually reaching the Earth. It turns out that wavelength is the same wavelength which a large proportion of the light which is put out by our sun fits into this wavelength, and also a large proportion of the light that gets through the Earth's atmosphere fits into this very narrow wavelength at which photosynthesis is possible. So the basics of physics and chemistry dictate at what wavelength photosynthesis is possible. They also dictate the wavelength of light produced by the sun. There's no reason to think these should be connected, but we see these are really tightly connected in reality. That is this very narrow wavelength of visible light, which is produced by the sun and is filtered through the atmosphere and is optimal for photosynthesis. So this is one of the kind of hints at design at the kind of physical and chemical level, which makes biology possible.
Yeah, I think atheists often, they kind of overstate the power of evolution,
Yeah.
which is they think, well, okay, once we can explain life, that kind of just does it right there. And you're pointing out that it's even more fundamental than that. You need certain constants at the Big Bang, and then you need certain natural orderly laws that even allow for evolution to take place here. So that's definitely a good challenge to the atheists. One of the things I guess more fundamentalist Christians might have a problem with is, but how can we possibly square this with the creation account in the Bible? What would you say to them?
Very briefly, I would say that exactly how to interpret the creation account has been controversial over the history of the church. That various major thinkers, such as Augustine, had basically non-literal views of Genesis, and there's a range of different views that I think are legitimate, that are a reasonable interpretation. Particularly when we take the text in its ancient context, then we see what it's intending to do is different than we might assume coming at it with 21st century kind of scientific eyes. So there's lots of excellent work on that. My favorite is from John C. Collins, presenting a view called the analogical days view. I think that's very convincing. But I've written some things on that online that people can look up as well. So I recommend for those who want to, you really need to dig into it deeper, I guess, to work that out.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I don't mean to, it's kind of hard to talk about this. I don't mean to be kind of playing into this kind of dichotomy where you either have to be a young earth creationist or an old earth evolutionist. There's a lot of apologists nowadays who they do take the old earth view, but then they still do kind of cite some problems they have with the theory of evolution. So there's a wide range of views to take here. So it's not just kind of this dichotomy. You did say that you wanted to talk about hyperevolution kind of as a challenge to specifically young earth creationism.
Yeah, so this goes back to the question you asked about micro versus macro. And I think I mentioned before that there's some recent work by young earth creationists where they're acknowledging a lot more diversity within the biblical kind than had previously been acknowledged. This presents quite a major problem in terms of how to account for the origin of this diversity. For instance, at quite a low level, even if we say it's just at the family level as a biblical kind, we see huge genetic differences between, say, different members of the cat family, like tigers and lions and house cats and such. And these genetic differences are on the order of the same extent of difference as we see, for instance, between humans and chimpanzees. So the huge, in terms of the amount of information, there's a lot of genetic difference there that needs to be accounted for. And now it seems the mainstream young earth position from Answers in Genesis and some other young earth speakers and writers is increasingly accepting that there has been a lot of evolution that's happened within kinds, which requires, within the very short time span of the young earth, it requires hyperevolution, requires extraordinarily fast rates of evolution, much more than we see in the lab or such. So ironically, the young creationist actually has to, it seems, if they accept that there is significant diversity within kinds, which the evidence seems to be pushing them towards, they have to accept this incredibly sped up version of evolution, whilst at the same time claiming that, well, evolutionary mechanisms can't really achieve very much. So I think there's an internal contradiction there, which is kind of just being realized by a lot of people just very recently, as the genetic data has just really come out in the last 5 to 10 years. Huge amounts of genetic data that allow us to answer some of these questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So since I have you here, I've kind of the chance to ask you some questions that I've kind of always wanted to ask evolutionists. So, because you mentioned the tree earlier, the tree of life. So I have heard some people talk about how when we look at the fossil record, we don't actually see a tree. For example, they'll cite things like the Cambrian explosion, where it's kind of like you have these species here, and then all of a sudden you have all these other species popping up at the Cambrian explosion, and so it doesn't actually look like the tree.
I mean, so if you just looked at animals, then and you kind of arbitrarily chopped off the tree there, then you'd say, well, that doesn't look like a tree because you see initial diversity. But when you zoom out and see the bigger picture, I think it's fairly clear that you do see a tree. So you can fit animals within, you can fit the various phyla into other biological groups, and across the whole tree of life, connecting bacteria to humans and everything else. I think it's. I mean, a tree actually doesn't prevent there being kind of bursts of diversity at certain points. So I think that that looks like more of a problem when you kind of just chop off the tree at certain points. I would say, given the total evidence that we have, it seems kind of arbitrary to chop the tree at those points. Because the same pattern that convinces young Earth creationists that we should accept the biblical kind is a much wider biological group than they used to think. That same pattern extends much further up the tree. And it's that pattern that's convinces most biologists that there really is a unified network of life. And interestingly, a lot of leading intelligent design proponents also accept at least some form of common descent. So this is not just kind of an evolutionist myth or things which you hear from a lot of people who aren't really aware of the data.
That's a good point. Yeah. I'm sorry, I had something in my head and I was going to ask you, and now it just left me all of a sudden. I was going to say, okay, so it's kind of just a spin off of that. I think you've already answered it though, where it's just they'll say where we see the Cambrian explosion that fits more with special creation, and you're saying, but we're not justified in doing that because there actually is common descent lower than that, but people are just kind of arbitrarily cutting it off there.
Yeah, I mean the Cambrian explosion is definitely a mystery. I don't want to say that it's been solved or that we have a good account of that, but it's well outside my field of expertise. So that's one of the reasons I can't really comment on that. And also, yeah, I'm happy to say this is definitely one of the mysteries of evolutionary biology. Maybe God was particularly actively involved there. That's definitely possible for me as a Christian. But scientifically, I want to be more careful than a lot of people are. I want to be more cautious in making claims about proof or very strong evidence or anything, particularly when it comes to intervention. Certainly, there's mind involved in the process. I see lots of purpose in the evolutionary story, but it's less clear to me how that purpose was worked out at the kind of the level of mechanism or method.
Yeah, the atheists might kind of be like, well, come on, Zach, we got this perfectly good naturalistic theory. Why do you need to throw God into it for no reason? Come on now. But I think you've already made a very good case about that, which is we're not just talking about the complexity in evolution. It really goes all the way back to the beginning.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Again, I apologize. I should be. It's hard for me because I want to listen to you and not ignore you and write stuff down, but I get so many questions and they kind of leave my head. Okay, so as somebody who's not an expert on this, one thing I have heard, and so I may butcher this, so forgive me, but I think I've heard this before, which is we talk about the similarity in DNA between chimpanzees and humans, for example. And I think it was claimed that that similarity came from a specific 2% of the DNA code that we were looking at, and we were kind of ignoring the other 98% and considering as junk DNA. And then since then, it's come out that isn't junk DNA, that there is some use to it. Am I even close there?
I mean, there's something that's true there, but it doesn't relate to the similarity question, really, or it doesn't strongly relate. So the similarity is high regardless of which bit of DNA we're looking at, basically. That the overall similarity is somewhere like 95%. It depends how you count it. For instance, do you count a gene duplication where a gene has been copied? Do you count that as a difference, or do you count that as a similarity because you can trace it back to the original? This is debatable, and some bits are difficult to align for various methodological reasons. So that makes it difficult to work out what similarity they would have. So, for instance, repetitive regions are difficult to align. The question on junk DNA is interesting and is kind of an ongoing debate. What proportion of the human genome is functional? And it's a very difficult debate. Estimates range from around 10% to maybe 30 or 40% or maybe higher. And that's a very difficult debate that I think has not been answered. So there's a lot of people who have very strong views on that. Some people argue that the ENCODE project that you might have heard of has proven that it's all functional or something, which is simply not true. And other people argue it's definitely can't be more than 10% or 20% functional, and that's also not clear at all. So it's really uncertain, actually, but it seems to be somewhere between maybe 20% and maybe 30, 40% has a function at the nucleotide level. There's arguments that it couldn't possibly be as high as 30 or 40%, and I'm not sure about those. So I think that's still up for debate.
Okay, and just real quick, because I've heard different numbers on this. What is the percentage that's similar between chimps and humans?
The most careful account that I've seen is approximately 95%. But as I said, it depends on some technical questions of what exactly counts as a similarity and how you do the alignment. So there's no straightforward way to put a single number on that. It's not. I think it's fairly clear that it's incorrect to say that it's 99% or 98%. But it looks like it's over 90%, and it seems like it's around 95%. But it depends exactly how you calculate it.
Okay. So I'm trying to think through questions that I can hear like a hardcore creationist asking. I think one that comes to mind is because as Christians we believe that we're not just a physical body, right? We believe that there's a soul, and that soul has freedom of the will to make choices, and that is something that distinguishes us from animals quite a bit. So I guess, how do you think we can kind of square that with the process of evolution? Because evolution isn't just there's these animals and then all of a sudden there's humans. It's kind of this gradual change. So do you think there's a way we can answer the question of where human souls kind of get started in that process?
I think there's two things there that I'd both be cautious about. So actually, I don't have a particularly fixed view about the soul. It's entirely possible to be a materialist and a Christian. And there's a lot of Christian philosophers in particular who do take that view. If I did go that way, then I would definitely be a non-reductionist. But it's possible to be a non-reductionist whilst not having a dualist view of the soul. So that would be one way, kind of an emergentist view, that at some point when you had the right kind of complexity, then these high-level properties emerged. So maybe that's the view that I kind of incline towards, but you can definitely also have a soul view, and I think this is what the Catholic Church teaches. I might be wrong about this, that it's a certain point that God did kind of implant or did grant souls to human beings. Also, the question of whether evolution is gradual, it's not necessarily, because you can conceivably have a new species kind of beginning quite suddenly, and there being quite a sharp break point between one species and the next, even through a bottleneck of two people. Whether that's possible for the human population or not is debatable. There's been some recent work on that, and it comes down to the question of what counts as human, and which fossils, for instance, which fossil organisms for instance, Neanderthal and Denisovans, even earlier, whether we should count those as humans. And these are very difficult questions because we don't really know what these organisms were like, and what counts as a human person is hugely controversial from a kind of biological level. How to draw the distinction between this is definitely human, this is not. And as one piece of evidence that this is really difficult, it's not just an evolutionary story that I'm telling, is when you compare the accounts of different creationists. There's various tables that are available online comparing the different classification systems that creationists have offered over the years of these different fossils. Even whether Neanderthals are human or not, it has been debated between young Earth versus old Earth creationists, and all the various other fossils. Again, there's the spectrum, and everyone kind of has their own position on exactly how to classify these things. And that's good evidence that this is really a difficult problem, and there's not an obvious sharp split of where to draw that. And it's partly people are using different properties for how they're defining what counts as human. Yeah, so and then this opens up a whole range of possibilities of how God could have interacted with early humans and granted a particular group of organisms or a particular couple or whatever a soul. So I think there's a whole range of options that are open there and I think the data underdetermines the hypotheses here. So we're open to speculate a bit and to try and develop new models.
Yeah, I like what you said there. It reminds me of a quote from William Lane Craig, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, he said this in his debate with Christopher Hitchens, and it was something along the lines of, we as Christians, we can really be open to the evidence wherever it leads. So, for example, I fully admit I'm not an expert in this. I have my own opinions. I'll admit I kind of line up with Stephen Meyer. I've read a lot of his work on this, and so it goes to show that someone like you and I, we don't have to agree 100% on everything to be able to have these conversations. And William Lane Craig said, as Christians, we can be open to the evidence. We can have these discussions. And, if the evidence is in favor of evolution, that gives us some insight into how God created people. And if the evidence is against evolution, that still gives us some insight into how God created people. Whereas the atheist, they're kind of stuck with evolution, right? Because if they don't have a God who's capable of special creation, evolution is really the only game in town.
Yeah, and also I would kind of push back a bit against this dichotomy of evolution versus creation. So the atheist is stuck not just with evolution, but a particular kind of evolution that is purposeless, that has no kind of ultimate driving force, that has no intended goal. So when you kind of keep adding these specifiers, and then the atheist picture begins to look less and less likely, I think. So I would say that there's strong evidence for evolution, and unfortunately atheists have kind of been given a free card to use that as evidence for atheism, and apologists shouldn't give them that free evidence, because evidence for evolution is not necessarily evidence for atheism. Evidence for fine-tuned evolution would actually be evidence for theism over atheism. And I think the kind of evolution we see is, this is very controversial, but I think the kind of evolution we see is fine-tuned evolution, and this is certainly not evidence for atheism. I think it's probably evidence against it.
Is there any chance you could expand on that a little bit about the difference there is between fine-tuned evolution versus just evolution?
Sure. So these are things that I'm kind of thinking through and developing, so that it's kind of half-formed. But I think the evolutionary process itself would have to be set up a very specific way in order to end up in any kind of interesting complexity, let alone the complexity of, say, the human brain. So if we accept that premise, then there's a kind of fine-tuning involved in that process, that the parameters of evolution have to be set up a certain specific way. And if that's true, I think there's a fine-tuning kind of argument, fine-tuning evidence there, which would support theism over atheism. So it's not a question of a difference in mechanism, but a difference in kind of the shape of the whole process, and whether the whole process looks like it is pointing towards some kind of teleology, or whether it looks like it's just completely the result of blind metaphysical chance.
Hmm. Yeah, this has definitely been really interesting. I have to admit, I'm not as up to date on the literature as I would like to be for discussion like this. I think I'll definitely, if you would like to, I'd definitely like to have you back, and I can get more up to date on some things and maybe have some better questions for you. But before we get going here, what kind of work do you got coming up that you're?
Maybe just before I go ahead, just a couple of points I wanted to say on
Oh yeah,
some things that are not that well known about the creation, evolution, just discussion in general. Some things I want to put out there and happy to get feedback.
Don't rush. I wasn't trying to kick you off or anything.
Yeah.
Still got some time.
Just some quick points, and then I can go to the work I'm doing at the moment. So I think I've kind of said this before, but there is a history of controversy in how these things are interpreted in terms of the text in Genesis. So when you realize that there's not uniformity in how the church has treated this over time, I think that gives us room to breathe in the models that we accept. A lot of young earth creationists, I think, don't realize that prior to Darwin, there was a period of 50 or more years where an old earth was accepted by evangelicals in general. So people like Charles Spurgeon were very happy with an old earth well prior to Darwin. So the geological evidence for an old earth, astronomical evidence, but particularly geology was quite well established before Darwin. And Darwin was really building on that. And it was well established, and a lot of the work was done by Christian ministers, was done by Christians, and it was it was accepted by evangelicals as not really controversial that the Earth had a very long history. So this is one of the major problems with the way that young Earth creationism is often presented as this dichotomy, evolution versus young Earth creationism, was actually historically there was this period where some kind of old Earth progressive creation was the accepted account in the church. Related to this is modern young Earth creationism is really a 20th century thing, like flood geology. Some of the scientific claims around that are often kind of imported into people's assumptions about the text. But these are relatively recent developments, and they're particularly tied with Seventh-day Adventism. And if you look up online, there's various accounts of how this came to be. So there's a very strong Seventh-day Adventist influence on modern young Earth creationism that I think if people realize that, they might realize that this is not as clearly the kind of uniform teaching of the church through history as a lot of people have assumed. Related to the Seventh-day Adventism and the importance of the Sabbath and things, I think there's a very strong argument that the seventh day of creation is continuing until today. I think that's worth digging into for people who are interested in how to interpret the text. And the last point I'd want to say is that kind of going back to this fact that the geological evidence was accepted before Darwin, there are processes that are kind of evolutionary processes, long developmental processes that do happen in geology, that happen in astronomy. And a lot of Christians are happy with these, like old Earth creationists. And the question is, okay, if we're happy with these long evolutionary processes for in astronomy, and we accept that, but we also accept that Genesis teaches that God made the stars, maybe we could also be happy with God using long evolutionary processes in biology and God making the kinds of organisms. So the same Hebrew word is used for God making this, I think the stars and God making organisms. But a lot of Christians are very happy with God making the stars through basically an evolutionary process. So then the question is, well, okay, maybe why not organisms as well? So that would be my challenge there. Okay, and then going back to the question you just asked.
Well, actually, if I could say something.
Yeah, please.
Because this is extraordinarily interesting, and I always find it very interesting how when you look into the history of some of these issues, how it kind of breaks down some of the prior ideas we have in our minds. Like the Big Bang is a great example. Like the Big Bang, if you just listen to the young Earth creationists now, it's kind of this dichotomy between, well, you have to either believe in Genesis or Big Bang and evolution and atheism and all that kind of stuff goes together. And one thing a lot of people don't know is when the evidence for the Big Bang was first coming out, atheists fought against it tooth and nail. They didn't want it to be true because then if you had a beginning of the universe, if it wasn't just eternal in the past, well, now you had the problem of something creating the universe or needing a cause of the universe. But you can almost kind of, I don't want to say put the entire blame on maybe the more fundamentalist Christian types, but maybe in their kind of retreating from something like the Big Bang, that's because now we just think the Big Bang, well, that's just part of the atheist theory, right? And it's kind of the burden of proof is on the Christian to prove that the Big Bang fits more into our worldview, when that's not how it originated. It's kind of just fundamentalist Christians retreat from it, and then the atheists get all the evidence, and now they can say, well, the Big Bang, that's our thing.
Yeah, which is crazy because people were very unhappy with the Big Bang. And when you look into what atheists were saying, for instance, just in the early 20th century, people like Bertrand Russell and others, very famous atheists, they were very clear the universe has always existed, always will exist. That was their assumption, and at the time, scientifically, it kind of made sense. There were some hints against that, but it kind of made sense to think that. And when you see what they were thinking, then you can see why they would be quite upset with something like the Big Bang. And it's really unfortunate for Christians to grant that to atheism.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, the research you got coming up.
So I mean, in terms of this area, science and faith, I'm very interested in developing some of these things. This idea of fine-tuning, extending it from physics into chemistry and biochemistry. And can we talk about fine-tuning in biology? Can we talk about fine-tuning in the fundamental parameters of evolution? This is very controversial stuff. I've got to be careful working in and thinking about, but I think there's good reason to think the evolutionary process has to be set up a very specific way in order to get interesting results. And I think that's a kind of fine-tuning. So I want to develop that more, explore that a bit more. And I'm very interested in laws of nature and how these fit in with a Christian view versus naturalistic view. But most of my time is spent doing evolutionary research. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things there that I want to do, and understanding in particular, how do we get new things in evolution? How do we get new genes in evolution? So that's what my current research is focusing on.
Do you work with a lot of atheists?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of scientists, maybe half of them, are probably kind of agnostic. There's not that many that are like very loudly atheist, but most people are kind of secular, I guess, largely through never having really interacted with Christians on these kinds of topics. It's just the default view is some kind of non-religious view. But I think the area in general is very open to people presenting evidence. And I think that's what Christians should be doing.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was an interesting question because, if you were to listen to the atheists, then us Christians, we're kind of in an echo chamber where we just reaffirm each other's ideas. But, someone like you who works so closely with science and perhaps even some others who maybe aren't necessarily Christian, you are being exposed to the other side and the other argument.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So Christians have an advantage there, actually, that we know what the other side is. And atheists typically don't really have any idea of the strength of the evidence for Christian faith, which is unfortunate, but that's our opportunity.
Yeah. So, any last thoughts before we wrap up here?
No, I just hope that people keep looking into it. As I said, there's some things I've written online, so if they Google me, they'll find those quite quickly. And I'm very happy for people to contact me and ask questions. And I look forward to seeing responses that people have.
Yeah, absolutely. You also have some articles on Capturing Christianity. Website too. Yeah, it's funny. Cameron Bertuzzi, actually, he introduced us. So we've been in communication for quite a minute trying to set this up. Yeah, no, definitely. I would definitely want to get you back and try. This has definitely given me a lot to think about, and I definitely have realized, I need to get more up to date on the relevant literature here. So I do thank you for coming on and giving us all something to think about. And it's really important too, because again, we don't have to take one strict view one way or the other. You know, there's a wealth of views. We can look at the evidence. We can really be open to it, to just understand and appreciate God's creation more. And so I really appreciate you coming on and sharing this with us. Yeah, so the website is ZacharyArdern.com. You can follow him on Twitter at Zachary_Ardern. Dr. Zachary Ardern, thank you so much for being here, brother. And we'll definitely get you.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Absolutely.